Next slide. Let's go into ancient Egypt. Now, here we have 3,000 years of Egyptian history. Now, it wasn't originally called Egypt. Does anybody know what Egypt was originally called? Excuse me, say it again? Kemet. Does anybody know what Kemet means? Kemet means land of the blacks, or the black land. Okay? Egypt was a term that the Greeks used. As you see Alexander the Great, he's there. He came in around 332 BC, where he started to rule over Egypt. But before then, you had 3,000 years that goes back to 3200 BCE of black African pharaohs. Okay, so that's your timeline when Kemet became Egypt. Next slide, please. And when take the time to compare Egypt, we can compare it to the United States. 500 years ago, did the United States look like it does today? No. We had a lot of Native Americans who ran the United States at the time. Egypt is no different. It was a mega civilization. You had migration from the Levant, you had migration from the Assyrians, you had invasions. 12 invasions, in fact, that we know of. There could have been more. An invasion from the Hyksos, who were Asiatic people. An invasion from the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Vandals, the Cushites, the Nubians, who were also African, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, who took most of North Africa and made it a Roman province. The French also, Turkey came in the later dates, the Levant, and then, of course, the 7th century was the Arab nations. And the Arabs have not released their hold on Egypt since then. So here we have the modern day Egyptian. They don't identify with black African. And even if you ask them, are they African, they will tell you we're not African. Okay? So we're going to see if this resembles the modern day ancient Egyptian. Next slide, please. This is also modern day Egyptians. Okay? We're going to see if they resemble it. Next slide, please. This is the Nubian region. Aswan, Luxor, those regions. We're going to see if these individuals, keep those pictures in your head. We're going to see if they identify with the ancient Egyptian. Next slide, please. As you see here, you have reddish brown, dark brown individuals. Look like Africans to me. Next slide, please. This is the Pharaoh Seti. Next slide, please. Obviously, you have the long braided hair, something accustomed that African women still do to this very day. Next slide, please. More African women. Next slide, please. As you see, more brown skin, reddish skin. Now, when we're talking about, when we say they were black Africa, we're not just saying that they were black, just straight black, dark-skinned black. Black can range anywhere from blue black down to yellow. As you see, my mom, she was a black woman, but she's yellow. Okay, my auntie's out here right there. Sorry. That's my mom's sister. All right, so we're going to play a clip from an Egyptian in Nubia. And we want to see what the Nubians, what they believe Egypt was.
Egyptians are black. The real Egyptians are black. Because the real Egyptians, they are real Africans. So those people in Lower Egypt, you see, in Cairo, Alexandria, and the Falahins area, they were mixed between the Turkish, Mamluks, French, English, Romans. So those people who come to attack Egypt in that time, they couldn't come to Upper Egypt, to the south, which we still have the same color, our dark color, or black color. So they couldn't mix with us.
Okay, what question?
Yes, اللي كلهم you see I explained to him about the Nubians and the Egyptians. They were not white, they are black Africans. So we say now ليه هنا الناس لسه سمر في الصعيد بحري بيض. He said the people in Lower East, most of them they are not Egyptians. They are Greeks from South.
Okay, so as we just heard him say, that the people who are in Upper Egypt, and if you understand about Egypt, you have what you call Upper Egypt, which is now considered Southern Egypt. And then you have Lower Egypt, which is now considered Northern Egypt, because the Nile flows up like that. Okay? So, that being said, he just explained that the people in the lower regions are still black. Okay, you might not have been able to understand him because his accent. Okay? And that'll take us to our next slide. What do we have here? A reconstruction of the new face of King Tut. Now, if anyone knows anything about Egyptian history, King Tut has plenty depictions of himself. So why do we need a French reconstruction of King Tut? We're going to see how accurate this is. Now, when people see these magazines, they think it's official. This is official, but we're going to see. And we're going to ask ourselves, next slide, please. We're going to ask ourselves, are we going to continue to trust dishonest scholarship, or are we going to trust how the ancient Egyptians depicted themselves? This was King Tut. This is how he looked. You look anything like that picture we just saw? No. Next slide, please. What would you say here? Would you say that's a close estimate of how King Tut would have looked? I think so. National Geographic might not agree with you, though. Next slide, please. Ooh. So now we got to make up our mind. Was he jet black or was he red? Well, if you know anything about Egyptian history, the jet black look represented the god form, represented the ascendant into a god. Most of the gods were painted black, if you know anything about Egyptian history. So he probably wasn't this black. Next slide, please. Another King Tut. Looked like a black man to me, right? Next slide, please. But this here, when you see these monumental developments, things that King Tut did, diamonds, gold, this is 100% gold. And you see this. Africans couldn't have done this. Absolutely not. No. Can't have that. So since these different things have happened, we see some of the sculptures being painted lighter than they normally were, and more issues. Next slide, please. This is Professor Zahi Hawass. He is the leading Egyptologist. Okay? And as you can see in that tomb, what do we see? What did he say? Now that's a joke, but he says, he's black African for God's sake. How are we going to fool him now? Let's see what they did. Next slide, please. The black pharaohs, conquerors of ancient Egypt, came into Egypt in the 25th dynasty. Finally, after 3,000 years of Egyptian history, black people finally got in the game. And it just so happened the 25th dynasty happened to be the shortest reign as well. Yeah. 80 to 100 years. We're going to discover if that's true today. We're going to uncover, not discover. Next slide, please. So, we talked about King Tut. This is King Tut right here. So the argument is stated by Eurocentrics that these are Nubian warriors being killed by the Egyptian king. So a lot of Egyptologists would tell you, well, Egyptians could have been black. Look at them killing the black people right there. So I guess we live in a world where all black people just got along, huh? Come on. Clearly, this is a black man, or maybe a reddish-brown black man, killing other Africans. Does anyone disagree with that? Next slide, please. This is the Pharaoh, Naramenes. Again, a very stereotypical Afro-Negroid face. This man united Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Next slide, please. This is the first Pharaoh, by the way. This is the Pharaoh Khufu. He commissioned as you see, you hear the name. When you listen to these names, ask yourself, do these sound like European names? Do these sound like Mediterranean names? Or do they sound like African names? Khufu, very similar to Kulu. So the Pharaoh Khufu, he commissioned the Great Pyramid of Giza. Next slide, please. This was Khufu again. There we can see his nose. Kind of look like mine. Now, Khufu built the Pyramid of Giza, had the Pyramid of Giza built. And right next to the Pyramid of Giza was, our next slide, please, the Sphinx. Does it make sense that that was Khufu? We don't know. If we go back to our last slide, look like him, don't it?
Yeah.
Look like the same man. But it's a grand mystery. Don't look like a mystery to me. Look like Khufu built that. Next slide. And one more. This is the pyramid that we're talking about. The Great Pyramid of Giza. One of the biggest pyramids constructed. Next slide, please. Queen Hatshepsut. Anybody heard of Queen Hatshepsut?
Yes.
This was an African woman who ruled the world for 20 years. We talked about Dr. King, right? Okay, this woman ruled the world. We have yet to see a black woman rule the United States. But this was a black woman who ruled the world for 20 years. Even as monumental as the things she did, she built the Dejeru, which is called the Holy of Holies. She conducted the expedition on the land of Punt. Many people even believe that this is the woman who drew Moses from the Nile. Very interesting stuff that you can study and research. And she's actually one of the main characters in my book. Next slide, please. More Hatshepsut. And also when you study Hatshepsut, you'll see that Hatshepsut sometimes wore a beard because in dealing with foreign affairs, she couldn't present herself as a woman because another nation would think they're weak. That's a weak nation. So sometimes she would depict herself with a long beard and strong muscles. Next slide, please. This is the temple that she built. Doesn't that kind of resemble some of the things we see in Washington? You see those pillars there? How it stands up? This is the Dejeru, the Holy of Holies, is what they call it. Next slide, please. Here is the Pharaoh Thutmose III, who succeeded Hatshepsut. Okay? Probably the person who was responsible for defacing all her works and claiming her works as his own, because he didn't want a female pharaoh to have the glory. This was her stepson. We don't know. We can assume that there was probably some tensions there, because she ruled until he was able to ascend if he was old enough. Next slide, please. He's also in my book, by the way. He's another main character in the book. Because again, Thutmose III. Thutmose III had 17 different campaigns, and he remained undefeated. Never lost in the war in his 56-year reign of his life. Next slide. This is probably how he would have looked, reconstructed. Next slide, please. This is the first power couple of ancient Egypt. Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti. As you look at Nefertiti, you can see those long dreadlocks. Can't you see that? Very African face. She had African hair. Clearly she was African. Nefertiti even assumed the throne and going upon the name she took upon when her husband passed away as Nefertari. Again, she had to claim that male-dominant name for foreign policy. Okay? Next slide, please. This is them again. As you can see them joined at the hand. That's black love. Okay, next slide. That's them again in the reconstruction. Next slide. And as you see here, this is another power couple. Amenhotep III. Again, listen to these African names. And Queen Ta, look at him. He got the afro puff. Okay? Look like a black man to me. Look at Queen Ta. She even got an afro. And then she got her dreadlock style right there. Okay? Another power couple of ancient Egypt. Next slide, please. As you can see here, this was also another depiction of Queen Ta and Amenhotep III. And if you take a look closely here, you have how they saw the world. And if you notice, all of them are bowing down before the throne. Now, it could be a malicious act why the two black king and queens is blotched out. Who knows? Could have been time, could have been malicious. But as you see here, you have someone from the Levant, you have other Africans here, you have Indo-European, you have your Asiatic, and you probably have your European, and then your Mediterranean as well. But they all are bowing down to the Pharaoh. Next slide, please. Let's go back to our last slide, please. The hair picks. That's in Luxor right there. Luxor Museum. Very vital proof to the African origins of the ancient Egyptians. Who else uses those type of hair picks? Next slide, please. This is Imhotep, known as the first genius of ancient Egypt. He was constructed the step pyramid of Dozier. He also is considered to be the father of medicine in ancient Egypt. And we're going to talk about how Hippocrates, who is considered the father of medicine, how he studied Imhotep. Next slide, please. This is another depiction of Imhotep. Next slide. Now, this is from Hippocrates himself, okay? And he said he was one of the Greek physicians who consulted the library of Imhotep's temple in Egypt and studied Egyptian medicine. Now, this man is considered to be the father of medicine, right? But here he's telling you he studied Imhotep. So how is he the father? He's really the son, if anyone. Next slide, please. This is the Imhotep you saw in The Mummy Returns. Does that look anything like the Imhotep we just saw? Next slide, please. As we see, the African woman. Beyonce knows right there, one of the most revered black women of our time. Look at that resemblance from the ancient Egyptian times. Still same hair braiding style. It existed 3,000 years ago. Next slide. This is another ancient Egyptian boy. Next slide. Oh! Egyptians had ships? We're going to learn about what they did with some of these ships. But as you can clearly see, these were African people. And it was thought, archaeologists came up with the thought that Africans never sailed. They never got on boats. They didn't know how to construct them. They didn't know how to do that. We see different here. This is in the museum again in Luxor. Next slide, please. This is a British artist who designed this in the 14th century of Cleopatra. Now, when we hear about Cleopatra, a lot of times we hear that she's Greek. Okay? But this is how the Europeans saw Cleopatra. As you see, she's a black woman. They gave her some buck teeth, but she's a black woman. Next slide, please. Look at the wave spinning. They had waves back in Egyptian times too. As you can see, look at the brother. You judge for yourself. Next slide, please. Michael Jackson even was back then. And it's funny, Michael Jackson's trying to fix his nose too, right? But the thing is here, I put this up here for a reason that why are so many Egyptian statues' noses gone? Why? Why the attacking of the noses? Next slide. What do you see here? You see some malicious activity going on? Why are they focusing on that nose? Because that big, broad afro nose, is that what they're worried about? Just so everyone knows, just even there are narrow noses that are African too. That's just dry heat that produces the narrow nose. So let's get that very clear. You can have a narrow nose and be black too. Next slide. More noses missing. There is a rumor that Napoleon was responsible for this. Napoleon or Alexander the Great. When they came to Egypt, they looked up and seen these Negro faces. They were like, oh, heck no. No, we locking this down now. Blow them noses off so we don't know that these people was African. That's speculation. We have no proof on that. So that's one thing that we have to stop saying. We don't know if Napoleon or Alexander the Great was responsible, but with this dishonest scholarship, we can definitely say it's a possibility. Next slide, please. This is on Ramses III's tomb. Sure, you've heard of Ramses. Sometimes he's referenced to be the pharaoh of the Exodus, which I disagree with, because I have reasons to. But this is how the ancient figure A is how the ancient Egyptians saw himself. As you can see, he's a black man. Figure B is the Indo-European. Figure C is other black Africans. Figure D is the Semite, who are currently in Egypt to this very day. But as you can see, figure A and figure C are pretty much the same. So Egyptians saw themselves just as black as other Africans. Next slide, please. What is Hollywood trying to tell us? This is from the movie Exodus. What is Hollywood showing us? They're showing us that the ruling elite were all white in most of these movies, and the slaves were all black. So what we have is being done is, you're saying what happened here in America happened in ancient Egypt. Now, are we seeing that's true? Absolutely not. Next slide, please. Gods of Egypt is another movie. This is, again, the ruling elite is all Caucasian, and the slaves are black in these movies. Now, this doesn't happen by accident, guys. Because even if you know anything about developing movies, you have a casting director. Does anybody know what a casting director does? Casting director goes out and finds people for these roles. So he said, all the ruling elite are white, slaves are black. This didn't happen by accident, and it doesn't ever happen by accident. It's made like this. Okay? Next slide, please. So the Gods of Egypt director in Lionsgate issued an apology because of the backlash that they faced because of these movies. 2016, the Gods of Egypt were under fire for showcasing why a mostly white cast. So after facing the backlash, the director Alex Proñez, the director also of Knowing and iRobot, he released this statement. He said, the process of casting a movie can have complicated variables, but it is clear that our casting choices should have been more diverse. I sincerely apologize to those who I offended in the decisions that we made. Lionsgate also issued this statement. They said, we recognize that it is our responsibility to help ensure the casting decisions to reflect the diversity of culture and of the time periods portrayed. In this instance, we failed to live up to our own standards and sensitivity of diversity, for which we sincerely apologize. Lionsgate is deeply committed to making films that reflect diversity to our audience, and we have, will, and try to do better. This is the apology for the backlash. But if it wasn't no backlash, would we get an apology? No. Now, it's very clear to understand this. This is not about black and white. Okay? This is about ruling elite and powers in place to suppress a certain people. Now, in order for dishonest scholarship to continue, you have to have a victim. And it just happens to be African Americans.